Did you know that Sony and Nintendo were not always rivals? They once had a relationship as partners. But their partnership would end in betrayal after some shady behind-the-scenes backdoor deals that would sour their relationships. But out of that betrayal, we got one of the greatest consoles ever. In order to tell this story, we have to go way back to 1985, when the original Nintendo first hit the North American market and soon became the top-selling video game console in the stores, making Nintendo the new king of the video games. Nintendo dominated over their main competitor, Sega. Their console, the Master System, which sold very well in Japan, was not very popular in the US. So this forced Sega to come up with a new console to compete with their main rival, Nintendo. And they did. They came up with the Sega Genesis. It was an immediate hit. It was 16-bit instead of 8-bit, making it more powerful than the Nintendo, finally making Sega a worthy competitor. So this puts Nintendo in quite a difficult situation. Despite all their success, it's not going to be enough. They're going to be forced to create a new console better than the NES. Now, fortunately for them, they're going to find an unlikely ally in another Japanese company, and that company is Sony. Now, mind you, back in the 80s, Sony wanted to have nothing to do with video games. They made their money selling high-end consumer electronics, like the Sony Walkman. Plus, Sony was a much bigger company than Nintendo. They also made movies and television shows, as well as a music company. So they had no interest in competing with Nintendo. At that time, Sony considered video games to be kids' toys because they were targeted toward the younger generation. Nevertheless, their partnership with Nintendo would be good for both companies, as they both would share in the profit of the new console. And that new console that came out was the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo would further cement their dominance in the video game market over Sega, with not only better graphics, but better sound. And the audio chip they used in the Super Nintendo was Sony's design, and that was their contribution to the Super Nintendo, which made it such a great console. I had a Super NES back then, and I did notice that the sound was more cinematic over the Genesis. But I had no idea Sony's contribution in this until years later. Sega had once again been upstaged by Nintendo. However, they were working on something that would change the video game industry forever. Because you see, back then, the main format of video games was cartridges. They were becoming obsolete. With the invention of the CD-ROM, which could hold way more storage, it became the obvious choice for the direction of video games. And Sega took advantage of this first when they created the Sega CD. Now, they created it as an add-on to the Sega Genesis, a very expensive add-on I might add, but it still was in the right direction, which caught Nintendo off guard. Once again, they had been upstaged by Sega, which forced them to go back to the drawing board to come up with a new console idea. The Nintendo didn't know how they were going to build a CD-ROM console, but fortunately for them again, they knew somebody who did know about CD-ROMs. They went back to their old partner, Sony, which had actually helped to develop the CD-ROM a few years prior. A deal was struck, and Sony went into production to build Nintendo's first CD-ROM console. But sometime during the development of the console, Nintendo started to get cold feet, as they realized that Sony would retain the ownership of the CD-ROM since it was their property, and Nintendo was only using it. So this didn't sit well with Nintendo, but instead of backing out of the deal, they continued to let Sony think everything was okay, and they continued to work on the console. But Nintendo secretly had talks with another company, Philips, which was Sony's European rival,
and offered them the same deal, only with a more favorable outcome in Nintendo's end. And so Philips agrees, and they began working on the console too, unbeknown to Sony at the time.
In June of 1991, Sony went to CES to announce their partnership with Nintendo on a new console. They had went through several different prototypes and ultimately ended up on this one. And you're not going to believe what they called it. The Nintendo PlayStation. I kid you not. That's a bit of foreshadowing right there. And it truly would have been an awesome machine had it went to production. But that was just not meant to be. But the very next day at the CES show, Nintendo would drop a bombshell when they announced their partnership with Philips. And the created console they created was called a CDI, an equally impressive machine. They were also able to make some licensed Nintendo properties from like Mario and Zelda. Sony was furious. Nintendo had betrayed them and publicly embarrassed them by working with their rival behind their back. Now the Sony execs that were once again Sony making video games were fully on board. They wanted to crush Nintendo. And Nintendo's betrayal just didn't stop there. They ultimately dropped Philips as well. Ultimately decided they was going to build their own console. But since Philips had pretty much already had their console built, they decided to go ahead and let it go to market. However, it sold very poorly. Not so much because of the technology, which was great at the time, but it had a problem with lack of third-party support, which meaning games. It just was not that good. Plus, they were not releasing enough of them consistently, so it died on the shelf. Meanwhile, Sony took everything they had learned on the production of the Nintendo PlayStation and started making their own console version. 4 years later, September 1995, they released the Sony PlayStation. It's ironic they kept the name PlayStation from their project to insult Nintendo. And the rest is history, as you already know. The once video game king had actually made its own worst enemy. Sony did go ahead to dominate over Nintendo. Nintendo actually went on to release their next console that following year, 1996, the N64, which was not a bad console. Actually, many people think it was the last great cartridge console, which it was, but it was just that, obsolete cartridge console. It wouldn't be after to September 2001 when Nintendo would release their first CD-ROM console, the Nintendo GameCube, which mind you was a whole year after Sony had already debuted their PlayStation 2. But ultimately, I have to thank Nintendo, because if this had never happened, we probably would not have the Sony PlayStation today. I mean, Sony probably would have eventually got into video games, but definitely don't think back in 1996 they wouldn't have. The Nintendo PlayStation today remains an important piece of gaming history. And even though I would have loved to see it, and I still wouldn't mind looking at it, I'm glad it never happened.